The crystal chandelier above the ballroom of the St. Regis didn't flicker, but for a second, the air in the room seemed to thin until I couldn't breathe. I was 42 years old, standing in a dress that cost more than my first car, and my ex-husband, Julian, was smiling at me with the predatory grace of a man who thought he had already won. He leaned in, the scent of his expensive bourbon clashing with the delicate lilies on the table, and whispered loud enough for the surrounding donors to hear that I should probably leave before the security team realized I wasn't on the vetted list. "Elena, darling," he said, his voice dripping with a feigned, oily concern. "This event is for the university's primary benefactors, not the secretaries who used to file their papers. It's embarrassing for both of us, really." He didn't know that the folder tucked under my arm contained a digital forensic audit of the very trust fund he was currently using to impress the board of directors. He didn't know that I hadn't come to beg for a seat at the table. I had come to take the table back to the woodshop. Before we dive deeper into how a man like Julian thought he could erase 15 years of my life with a forged signature and a smirk, I want to officially welcome you to the channel. We tell stories here that remind us that the truth always has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it's buried. If you enjoy narratives about justice, strategy, and the strength of the human spirit, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. It truly helps us keep these stories coming. Also, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop your city or state in the comments below. I try to read as many as I can. Now, let's go back to that ballroom and the choice Julian made that would ultimately become the architect of his own destruction. The silence that followed Julian's comment was heavy, the kind of silence that happens when people are more uncomfortable with the rudeness of a scene than the cruelty behind it. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the cracks he was so desperate to hide behind his tailored Italian suit. We had met when I was 23, two ambitious graduates with nothing but student loans and a shared dream of building a venture capital firm that actually cared about ethics. For a decade, I was the silent engine. I was the one who stayed up until 3 a.m. perfecting the term sheets, while Julian handled the golf games and the handshakes. We were equal partners until the day he decided that equal was a moving target. 3 years ago, during a messy divorce he orchestrated with a precision that would have been impressive if it weren't so heartless, he managed to trigger a lifestyle clause in our prenuptial agreement that I hadn't even realized existed. The clause stated that any behavior deemed detrimental to the firm's public image would result in a total forfeiture of equity. Julian had spent 18 months prior to our split creating a paper trail of my supposed instability, documenting outbursts that never happened and financial irregularities he had actually engineered himself. By the time I stood in front of a judge, I looked like a liability, and Julian looked like a long-suffering saint. I walked away with a small settlement and a non-compete agreement that effectively barred me from the industry I helped build. He kept the firm, the penthouse, and the reputation. But Julian had made one fatal mistake during his calculated takeover. He assumed that because I was quiet, I wasn't paying attention to the back-end architecture of our private family trust. After the divorce, I moved to a small town 3 hours away. I didn't cry, and I didn't vent on social media. I took a job as a freelance data analyst for a mid-sized logistics company, living a life that was invisible to the high society circles Julian now dominated. It was during a late-night deep dive into some legacy server files I'd backed up years ago, purely for tax purposes, that I found the ghost. Julian had been moving money out of the firm's secondary accounts into a shell company long before we even started discussing divorce. He wasn't just trying to get rid of a wife. He was embezzling from his own partners to fund a lifestyle that the firm's actual profits couldn't sustain. He had built a gilded cage, and he was using my forfeited equity to pay the interest on his mounting debts. For 2 years, I worked with a man named Silas. Silas was a retired forensic accountant who lived 2 doors down from my new, modest apartment. He was 70, cranky, and had a mind like a steel trap. Together, we spent thousands of hours cross-referencing Julian's public filings with the private ledger I discovered. We found a pattern of consulting fees paid to an entity called Eris Holdings. Eris Holdings, as it turned out, was registered in a jurisdiction that Julian thought was impenetrable. But Silas knew a guy, and I knew the passwords to Julian's old personal cloud. Passwords he had never changed because he believed I was too technologically illiterate to ever use them. We weren't just looking for revenge. We were building a gallows out of his own spreadsheets. The ticking clock started 6 months ago when Julian announced he was taking the firm public. An IPO meant a rigorous federal audit. He was in a race to replace the funds he'd borrowed before the SEC investigators started poking around. He needed a massive influx of private capital to bridge the gap, which was exactly why he was at this alumni gala tonight. He was courting a group of international investors who were prepared to sign a $300 million commitment letter. If he got that signature tonight, he could cover his tracks, pay back the consulting fees, and I would never be able to prove a thing. This was the final hurdle. I had one window, one night, and one chance to show the world exactly who Julian Vance really was. Standing there in the ballroom, I felt the weight of the flash drive in my clutch. Julian's current girlfriend, a 26-year-old influencer named Cammie, draped herself over his arm and looked at me with a mix of pity and boredom. "Is everything okay, Jules?" she asked, her voice high and melodic. Julian didn't break eye contact with me. "Everything's fine, babe. Elena was just leaving. She has a long drive back to wherever it is people like her live now." I smiled then, a small, controlled movement of my lips. "Actually, Julian, I'm here because I heard you were speaking about the firm's unprecedented transparency during the keynote. I thought you might want to include the 2022 Eris Holdings disbursement report in your slides. It seems like a glaring omission for an IPO, don't you think?" Julian's face didn't change, but his eyes went cold, that flat, shark-like stare that used to make me tremble. Now, it just made me feel clinical. "I don't know what you're talking about," he snapped, his voice dropping an octave. "You're delusional." "Security." He raised a hand, signaling a pair of large men in suits near the entrance. I didn't move. I knew the security lead, a man named Marcus who had worked for us for 10 years. Marcus had stayed with Julian after the divorce, but Julian had treated him like furniture. I had treated him like a human being. 2 weeks ago, I had met Marcus for coffee and shown him the photos of the offshore accounts Julian was using to avoid paying the security team's pension contributions. We've reached a bit of a turning point in Elena's journey. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with the word accountability. It lets me know who is really locked into the strategy of this story. It's about to get much more intense as the public confrontation reaches its peak. Make sure you've liked the video as well. It really helps the algorithm show this to others who might need a reminder that the underdog can win. Now, let's see what happens when Julian realizes he doesn't own the room as much as he thinks he does. Marcus approached, but he didn't grab my arm. He stood between me and Julian, looking not at me, but at his boss. "Is there a problem, Mr. Vance?" Marcus asked. Julian gestured wildly. "Get this woman out of here. She's trespassing. She's harassing the guests." Marcus didn't budge. "Actually, sir, Ms. Elena is a registered guest of the dean. She's here as a keynote consultant. I can't remove her without a direct order from the university provost." The color drained from Julian's face, replaced by a mottled, angry purple. He realized then that his influence had a perimeter, and I had just stepped inside it. The international investors, 3 men in impeccably tailored suits, were now watching the exchange with growing curiosity. "Julian," one of them said, stepping forward. "Is this the former partner you mentioned? The one who stepped away for health reasons?" I turned to the investor, a man named Mr. Chun, and extended my hand. "My health is excellent, Mr. Chun. My departure was less of a step away and more of a push. But I'm not here to discuss the past. I'm here to discuss the future of your $300 million. I'm sure Julian has shown you the growth metrics, But has he shown you the liability ledger for the heiress subsidiaries? I opened the folder I was carrying. It wasn't full of legal threats. It was full of simple, easy-to-read graphs. Silas had helped me design them, so that even someone with no financial background could see the cliff the firm was walking toward. Julian tried to snatch the folder, but I stepped back, and Marcus subtly shifted his weight to block him. "You're breaking your non-compete just by being here," Julian hissed. "I'll sue you for every cent you don't have. I'll make sure you never work in this town again." I looked at him with genuine amusement. "Julian, a non-compete is only valid if the underlying contract wasn't founded on fraud. Since you forged my signature on the 2021 equity transfer, the one Silas and I had analyzed by a handwriting expert last month, the entire agreement is void. In fact, according to the bad faith clause in our original partnership deed, your attempt to defraud me actually triggers an automatic reversion of all voting shares to the original founder. Which, if you remember the filing from 2008, is me." The room seemed to tilt for Julian. The choice that would destroy him wasn't just the embezzlement. It was the arrogance of thinking he could use the same legal weapons he'd used to hurt me to protect himself. He had relied on my silence. He had counted on me being too broken, too tired, or too poor to fight back. He hadn't realized that for the last 2 years, I hadn't been mourning our marriage. I had been auditing it. The international investors were now huddled together, speaking in low, urgent tones. Mr. Chin looked at Julian, then at me, then back at Julian. "Mr. Vance," Chin said, his voice cold, "we will be delaying the signing of the commitment letter. We require a full independent audit of these heiress accounts by a firm of our choosing." "It's a lie," Julian shouted, his voice cracking. People at the nearby tables were now standing up, phones out, recording the collapse of the man who had been the visionary of the year only months prior. "She's a bitter ex-wife trying to tank the IPO. This is character assassination." I didn't need to say another word. The truth didn't need me to shout. I simply handed the flash drive to Mr. Chen's assistant. "The encrypted files are all there," I said quietly. "Password is the date Julian opened the first shell account. He'll remember it. It was our 10th anniversary." I turned and walked toward the exit, my heels clicking rhythmically on the marble floor. Julian tried to follow me, but Marcus put a firm hand on his chest. "I wouldn't, sir. The police are downstairs. It seems there was a report filed regarding the forged signatures on the SEC filings. They'd like to speak with you before you leave the building." Julian slumped. The man who had spent his life controlling the narrative had finally run out of pages. As I walked out into the cool night air, Silas was waiting in his old, beat-up sedan at the curb. He rolled down the window and grumbled. "Did you give them the graphs? People love graphs." I laughed, a real, deep laugh that felt like it had been trapped in my chest for years. "I gave them everything, Silas. I gave them everything." The fallout was swifter than I expected. Within 48 hours, the IPO was pulled. Within a week, Julian's partners had filed a massive civil suit against him for breach of fiduciary duty. The forensic evidence Silas and I provided was so overwhelming that the DA didn't even offer a plea deal. Julian lost the firm, the penthouse, and eventually, Cammy, who disappeared the moment the credit cards were declined. I didn't go back to the firm. I didn't want the ghost of that life. Instead, I used the reverted shares to force a liquidation, ensuring all the employees got their pensions and severance. Then, I started something new. Something small. Something honest. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this journey. Stories like Elena's remind us that while the wheels of justice turn slowly, they do eventually grind exceedingly fine. If you found this story powerful, please share it with someone who might need a reminder that their voice matters. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button before you go. It really helps the channel grow and allows us to share more stories of resilience and truth. I'll see you in the next one. But until then, remember, never underestimate someone who knows how to read the fine print.